only valuable explanation that I have seen that argues that religion is adaptive has come from actually a good friend of mine, David Sloan Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, who has argued from a group selectionist perspective, right? Whereby he argues that groups that score higher on religiosity will have greater, communality, greater cohesiveness, greater proclivity to engage in reciprocal, relationships, and therefore, because of that, they will outsurvive groups that are not religious. And now the reason why he gets into a lot of hot water for that argument is that most evolutionary scientists in general, and certainly evolutionary psychologists in particular, tend to exhibit some disdain towards group selectionist argument.
Yeah.
So well, do you have another adaptive argument beyond this one?
Oh, yeah. I can give you a very, very rapid account for the individual utility of religious ideation.
Okay.
Look, I mean, I'll give you the 2-minute version. It's only taken me about 30 years to figure this out. Okay, so imagine this. Imagine that we know that human females are sexually selective, voluntarily. That distinguishes them from chimpanzees. Yep. Okay, because the chimp females will mate with the dominant males, but only because the dominants chase the subordinates away. Because they'll mate indiscriminately otherwise. Whereas human females are choosy. We know that. Okay, now, think about it this way. Male dominance hierarchy. Now, imagine not the male dominance hierarchy. Imagine the set of all possible male dominance hierarchies. Okay, now imagine that there's a mode of being that increases the probability that a person will ascend any one of the possible set of male dominance hierarchies. Okay, consider that the admirable individual. And then consider the meta-admirable individual as the person most likely to conquer all possible sets of dominance hierarchies. Okay, that's the person that the men themselves will elect to the highest position of the male dominance hierarchy. They preferentially leave more offspring, like way more. And so, to me, that's part of the basis of the emergence of religious abstraction, is that there's a moral ideal that characterizes the set of qualities that on average will raise you up to the top of male dominance hierarchies. And the idea that that's power and brutality, which is kind of the postmodernist, let's say, feminist idea, that's just incorrect.
But why do you have to root that argument in a supernatural mechanism? I mean, everything that you said could hold perfectly true without it requiring a religious angle to the story.
It depends what you mean by supernatural. Like, I would say that, because the distinction between a disembodied abstraction and a metaphysical entity is very difficult to draw. And so I could say, the ultimate mythological hero has never existed. But that doesn't mean that he's not real. He might be more real than anything else, in the same way that numbers are more real than anything else. Because an abstraction, now imagine that the ultimate admirable person is a fictional abstraction that's a pattern, like a pattern of spirit. It's a pattern that you can embody in action. Well, and imagine as well that we've learned to identify that because of the hundreds of thousands of years that we spent in dominance hierarchies. And you can admire someone, man. That happens immediately. Well, the reason you admire them is because their behavior partakes of an archetypal pattern. And that archetypal pattern as such, you could think of as a spiritual entity. Now, I'm not making the claim in this argument that that spiritual entity has anything other than an abstract existence. But I would make the case is that don't be denigrating the reality of an abstract representation, because the admirable, let's say, never dies. It exists forever. It's embodied everywhere. It's part of every psyche. It's part of every culture. So you could think of it as, if you think about human beings as neurons in the node of human society, you can think of the abstract ideal as a meta idea that emerges out of all those nodes. And you can give it what's essentially eternal and deathless existence in that manner. Now, that's a reduction. That's a reductionist religious argument, right? I've dispensed completely with the overarching metaphysics, because I'm not positing the actual corporeal existence of a deity, let's say, but it's the next best thing. And then I would say perhaps that what happens to people in mystical experiences where they encounter the archetype is that they make direct contact with their own representation. It's like this representation exists as an emergent property of the cognitive interactions of humanity as a whole. And so it's represented externally. But then the brain, the individual brain, can represent that kind of microcosmically in some sense as part of its own structure, which is why even 3 or 4-year-old children can watch a complex movie like a Disney movie, immediately pick out the hero and become entranced by it. And so, well, I'll leave it at that. And that's not the whole set of ideas.
I think round 3 of our conversation, we're going to have a discussion strictly on evolution and religion. That would be a very fruitful conversation.
That would be a really good, well, because what I'm trying to do, I'm doing these biblical lectures right now that you may or may not know about. I'm doing the 3rd one tonight, but
oh, good.
Like I'm starting from a particular methodology, and the methodology is I'm going to make an account for the evolutionary emergence of religious ideas as adaptive structures with no metaphysical presuppositions whatsoever, while simultaneously not eradicating the possibility of an additional metaphysical substrate, because there are things about the nature of human experience that we do not understand at all. And I would say, for example, I do not believe, A, that we understand anything about consciousness, and B, I don't think we understand anything about psychedelics. Those things are seriously weird. And they're weird they're so weird that when we first encountered them in the 1960s, we instantly made them illegal. We wouldn't even let scientists study them. We were more afraid of those things than the Catholics were afraid of Galileo.
Right.
So
are you familiar with Laura Betzik? Does that ring a bell? So
no.
Laura Betzik is a Darwinian historian who published a paper where she did a content analysis of the Old Testament. It's actually going to tie several things that we talked about today. So what she looked at is the status, the known status of different protagonists in the Bible. So they might be prophets, they might be generals, they might be kings, there might be slaves, there might be soldiers, and so on. And then she looked at how many women were ascribed to them. Like, in other words, this guy has 12 wives or 12 sexual concubines. And not surprisingly, she replicated the general phenomenon that both you and I are very familiar with, which is with greater status accrue greater access to sexual opportunities with women. And so I think so after we get off, I'll send you a copy of the paper, because I think that fits very nicely within what you're talking about. You think 2 things is, first of all, the male dominance hierarchy is an election mechanism for sexual, for reproductive success. Right. And it isn't power, it's election. The men get together and they say, this is the best of the men. And they do that. So Franz de Waal looked at the emergence of chimpanzee dominance hierarchies in the males. It's not power and brutality, too unstable. Because if you're a brutal chimp dictator, then 2 of your compatriots who hate you can take you out. And they do that all the time. And of course, that happens in human societies. The more stable chimp rulers are very reciprocal in their interactions with other males and with the women and the children. Right.
And that's a major finding, man. That's a killer finding, because it partially demolishes the notion that it's power that produces a hierarchy of authority, which is the postmodernist claim. It's like, no, it isn't, man. It's competence.
Listen, one of the key mating preferences, of both men and women, that's considered a necessity, is intelligence, right? And of course, intelligence is heritable and so on. So yes, to some extent, having brawn might be attractive from a woman's perspective when shopping for good genes in a short-term mating context. But the absolute necessity that almost all women will agree on is that the guy be intelligent. And that's why, by the way, they always say things like, I really love a guy who's funny. Now, the reason why they say that is because humor is actually highly correlated with intelligence. It's a proxy of intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. All right.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is too, it also may not be so much that women are going after brawn as that they're not going after its opposite.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Right, because,
the wimpy beta guy who's submissive, sucking his thumb in the corner. That's what you're talking about?
yeah, exactly. It's like he's out of the competition because a woman doesn't need another child.
Also known as a Canadian senator. Also known as a Canadian senator.
Yes. Yeah.
I got Jordan Peterson to smile.